we are back this time with Neale Jones. So welcome, Neale. It's good to have you on.
Kia ora, Blake. Kia ora, Paul.
Kia ora. You've been in the room where it happens, essentially with budgets and stuff like that. What is your impression of what we saw yesterday?
Well, I think what Nicola Willis was trying to do was to just deliver the tax cuts that she promised in the election campaign. I think, while I don't agree with her politics, she did a very good job of underselling the tax cuts in advance. There was a lot of chatter about how she wouldn't be able to afford them, she wouldn't be able to deliver them, and I think the opposition was ready for her to fail to deliver on her promises. And she delivered basically what she had promised in the election campaign, which I think was probably politically smart from her perspective. So yeah, look, I think the opposition was caught probably a little bit flat-footed by that. I think they were ready to say this is broken promises, and that didn't quite happen. And so I think she did reasonably well. The question I think will be, do voters just bank those tax cuts and say, thanks, it's nice but not game-changing, and I'm still grumpy about the economy, inflation, interest rates, and do the cuts that are made to pay for them start to cause problems for the government down the track? So I think that's the big question coming out of Budget Day.
Earlier in the show, we were talking, and I'll get your opinion as well, we were talking to Clint Smith about the disability stuff. So $1.9 billion. In my opinion, it sounds great in retrospect, but when you actually go and look at the finer details, it's not actually that great. Even though they made it sound like, oh, we fixed the problems, we did, jumped up and down. When you look at it, it just basically mainly for buildings, then people like me are not going to probably see much of it, really.
Yeah, look, that's right. One of the big challenges in budgets is cost pressures are really high. So you've got inflation, but you've also got the growing population, and you have other demographic factors you've got to put in there. And so that 1.1 billion, as I understand it, just kind of keeps the lights on, keeps what's happening now, but it doesn't actually make the investments the sector needs to improve. And so all the problems that were there before the budget will be there after the budget. They're just not going to get worse. So it could have been worse in this budget, but I don't think it's cause for celebration, is my take. And I think we're seeing that, if you look at the health budget, for example, it's in a far worse position even. So the health budget's going up by less than inflation. That means not only is it not buying the same things it bought last year, but actually, if you look at things like the aging population, you're looking at things like increasing requirement for advanced technologies, and you're looking at population growth, it means the sector has to do more with less, and we know that after a point that's impossible. We added 100,000 people plus to New Zealand last year, net. It's a city, we added basically a city the size of Tauranga to New Zealand, and we're not adding the extra health resources we need to pay for that. And so that just means, year to year, you won't see a huge difference. So next year, it's not like the health system's suddenly going to get a lot worse. But what happens is over sort of 5, 6, 7, 8 years, you keep doing this to pay for tax cuts, and eventually the health system degrades and people don't get the services they need.
Was there anything in the budget that genuinely surprised you?
Not really, but it was very much the budget Nicola Willis said she'd deliver. I was surprised they didn't deliver on that 13 cancer medicines promise. Now, there's legitimate debate about whether that's a good idea or not. There's some good arguments that the government shouldn't be favouring certain drugs, and there's some arguments in favour. But they did make a promise to some people who are pretty vulnerable, and they're not delivering on that. And I would have thought the politics of that is pretty bad for the government. I would have thought they'd made sure they'd deliver that one at least. So that did surprise me a bit, if I'm honest.
For me, it's like, it was one of their, if you're looking at it from both sides, it was one of their big campaign policies. And when you got to the budget yesterday, it just seems like it's on the back burner, nowhere to be seen, quietly put away in the cupboard. And that's a terrible impression for a policy that you campaigned so hard on, in my view.
And I think as well, yeah, I agree. And I think as well, the policy, there are a lot of little cuts the government made. There are something like 200 cuts, and some of them you look at and you go, well, no one's really going to notice that probably, like, on balance. That's one where I think there's a group of people who, are genuinely dying and looking for care and support and have a lot of public sympathy and are very vocal. Politically, as a government, you should try not to make cuts or fail to deliver promises where you're going to have people who have public sympathy, who are genuinely vulnerable, and who are going to be noisy about it. Those are the cuts that really actually cause you problems.
Yeah, because now they can cause unintentional death now.
Well, I was going to say, in terms of what the public kind of expects from the parties that we've got in power at the moment, Winston has long courted the senior citizen vote. There are still people out there who are just sort of hitting 65 going, thanks for the gold card, Winnie. What do you think the reaction is going to be to what felt like very little for senior citizens yesterday?
I was surprised. So I saw, they're getting about $4 a week or something extra, which is an absolute pittance. I mean, it doesn't buy you anything in 2024. You can't leave the house without spending $20 these days.
Oh, wasn't it $4 for couple?
Oh, right. Okay. Well, you've read it closer than I have. But I mean, Winston Peters is not a man without power in this government. He's Deputy Prime Minister. He can bring the government down, any moment he wants. And he's not afraid to play hardball. So I was surprised this one let slip. I don't know what quite happened there because, again, I think one of the challenges the government has is they've given $4 billion of tax cuts to landlords, and the problem with that is that's a very hard thing to explain the cost of living crisis. And so when you look at the tax package they announced, you look at any group, whether it's senior citizens or whether it's minimum wage workers, you even medium wage workers aren't getting much. You look at that compared to the $4 billion for landlords, and you go, hang on a second, why have you prioritised landlords? And I think that is a fundamental problem with the budget that will continue to dog them. Because any time someone sees something that's cut or that hasn't been what they expected, you realise, and Labor's prosecuting this line quite hard, you realise that actually this wasn't inevitable. You had a choice about what you gave your money to, and you chose to keep your promise to landlords.
What other speeches were you impressed by, apart from this Minister Willis yesterday, if you managed to see any of them?
I saw a few of them. I don't think the opposition speeches were great, if I'm honest. I remember being in opposition at budget time, and it's really hard because it is the government's day. The government has full spectrum dominance. They put out all the releases. They've got all these funding announcements. They've been working on the comms plan for months, and out it all goes, this massive dump. And the media are all looking at that. You're kind of a bit player in the opposition, and you get very little notice. So, you pre-write a speech in the weeks leading up to it, and then suddenly it's dumped on you, this budget, and you've got to rewrite it. And I felt that they hadn't had a chance to fully absorb it and rewrite their speech properly. So it sounded a bit like something they could have written 2 weeks ago. That's not a criticism of them. It's just the reality of it. I remember, the worst one I was involved in was when I worked for Andrew Little, and we wrote a whole speech about how child poverty was terrible and the government didn't care about it under John Key, and he announced a benefit increase of $25 a week. We were just totally flat-footed. We had to throw the speech out and start again. And so I think for the opposition, what tends to happen is budget day, you barely get a look in, and then in the coming days and weeks, you start noticing things that are cut. You start having groups coming out saying this isn't good enough, and the opposition starts to have a go. I saw, for example, this morning RNZ had a story that Nicola Willis forced to admit less than 3,000 families will actually get the $250 a fortnight that she promised before the election. So stories like that start to come up, and that's where the opposition has an opportunity, I think.
Is that where pre-budget announcements can come in really handy with crafting the narrative that the opposition puts out?
In what sense? You mean
But the pre-budget announcements are always going to be something that the government thinks is big and popular and is going to make them look good. They want to sell this as a good thing. But does that give the opposition a bit of an opportunity to go, right, this is where the people are getting wiggly, or this is what the reaction's been, so we need to play up on that and our reaction? Like, does it sort of inform each other like that?
Not really, because the pre-budget announcements are always good news stories for the government, and it still doesn't tell you what's in the budget. It still doesn't tell you what's in the budget. I think pre-budget announcements work really well for government. From a government perspective, I think one of the disadvantages of the budget process, when you've got a whole lot of good announcements, is you actually end up dumping it all in one go, and you don't get the kind of coverage you normally would from all those things. So that's why you want to do your pre-budget announcements to kind of get that coverage over time. I know Labor, for example, when they had far more spending initiatives than National did in this one. Even though they did pre-budget announcements, a bunch of good stuff got lost because it was just buried on the day. From a comms perspective, a budget's quite, it actually can be quite a disaster in terms of getting coverage for the positive things you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Another question that I've been asking everyone, most people this week. So I've been watching a lot of the events that Mr. Luxon has been going to, keeping a close eye on his, getting out and about. And he seems to be getting a cold reception everywhere he goes. Galas, ward nights, everything. And he gets a really cold response. And when he needs himself, and he gets as soon as he mentions the opposition, it's really, really loud ovation. So I'll ask you the same as I asked everyone. How bad is it 6 months in that he has to awkwardly stand there while his opposition is getting cheered? Has to make these comments like, oh, yay, cheer for him too. How bad is that?
Look, I think it's pretty bad. The Christopher Luxon is a historically unpopular prime minister. If you compare the polling of, say, Jacinda Ardern, John Key, Helen Clark at this stage in their prime ministerships, Luxon is well behind. And if you look at preferred prime minister, a recent poll had both Luxon and Hipkins equal on 25% preferred prime minister. That is astounding. Chris Hipkins, he's doing a decent job, I think, in opposition, but, this is not Jacinda mania. He is a prime minister who recently got swept from power. Labor's vote halved. It was an absolute humiliation for Labor. You wouldn't expect, no matter how hard he works and how well he does, you wouldn't expect Chris Hipkins to be level pegging with a brand new prime minister in his first 6 months in office. That is unheard of. The second thing is favourability. So Hipkins, in the same poll, it was the Talbot Mills poll, Hipkins was positive 13 net favourability. Luxon was minus 8. So more people are unfavourable to Luxon than are favourable to him. I remember even working for very unpopular Labor Party leaders who, if they were getting close to zero net favourability, you got worried. Luxon's minus 8. So he has struggled, I think, to get the public to warm to him. I think he was, he managed to get in because he was very effective, I think, as an opposition leader in prosecuting his key messages, focusing on cost of living. He did a very good job at that. And I think the weight of that and a bunch of other problems that Labor had brought in itself, as well as cost of living, brought the government down. He managed to step in, but there was never a love for Christopher Luxon. And we saw that in National's relatively low polling. They became government on 38% of the vote. They've had to rely on Winston Peters and ACT. So I think this is a real problem for him. I don't know how you get out of that. It's very hard when you have that level of baked-in negativity to turn that around. I think his only hope is just the economy improves and he manages to kind of tell people, look, we've made some hard decisions. It hasn't been easy, but I've got you back on track, and hopes that some goodwill reemerges. But yeah, it is a real problem for National.
Yeah. Would you agree then that some of the surprise policies, like the going back on smoking laws and the surprise cuts to disability, haven't done him any favours? Just to name a few, there are a lot more, of course.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think there is something about he just hasn't connected, but I think also there has been a messiness to the government, and part of that's been to do with the coalition agreements he agreed to, which I think he agreed to a lot of things he shouldn't have agreed to, such as the smoking. And I think if you look at the tax cuts, which I think he announced those tax cuts a couple of years ago, right when he started his leadership of National, and when he had no idea how the economy would be and how the books would be looking. And so to pay for it, they've had to make a bunch of cuts, and that's why you saw things like those disability cuts, which were not only mean but also incredibly bad politics. And so a lot of these problems he's brought on himself, both through policies he announced, which I thought were premature, and I think also based on the coalition agreements he made. And actually, I've been saying this right since they were signed. When I first looked at those coalition agreements, I saw a bunch of things in them that seemed politically mad, but the reason you would do them is because they cost no money. And he needed every dollar he could to pay for his tax cuts, which is why whole sections of the agreements would say Acting New Zealand First are about rolling back rights for Māori or the treaty. They're about cultural things around COVID-19 vaccines, the WHO, trans people in bathrooms and sports. These are things that a centre-right party that should be appealing to them in New Zealand should never touch, should never go near, that John Key wouldn't have in a million years entertained. But I think Christopher Luxon was just so desperate to get the money for his tax cuts, he didn't want to give Act New Zealand First things that cost money, and so he gave him a bunch of stuff that looked like it was free, but came with a political cost, and he's paying that now.
One more question before I hand back to Paul. So we had Gareth Hughes on the show the other night, and he used the phrase the most right-wing government in history or we ever had. Would you agree with Gareth with that statement?
Look, I was only a small child, a toddler when Muldoon was in power, and I was, Sid Holland's well before my time. So it's or Massey. So there's probably there may be examples of more right wing governments. I don't know, but certainly in terms of my lifetime, I'm 41 years old. I haven't seen a more right wing government. Certainly, the Richardson government in the 90s was pretty neoliberal, was pretty right in terms of cutting, probably more than this government. But I think this government brings a social reactionary attitude, which that national government didn't have. So if you look at both the economic but also the social, I think we are seeing a reaction that we haven't seen in our lifetimes. And it really is a step backward for New Zealand. And it's a step backward, like I say, from the John Key National Party. I think, I don't agree personally. I'm on the left. I don't agree with the economic policies of the National Party and Act and so forth. But, there is a difference between arguing over the sort of the balance of tax and spending and an argument that goes into also the social fabric of the country. And I think when you see things like the wound that's been opened up with Māoridom, you look at some of the victimisation of, say, trans people or some of the most vulnerable people in our society. You look at all of these, some of the rollback of COVID protections and things. I look at these things and I think, this is not where Middle New Zealand is. This is not where most fair-minded New Zealanders are. And it's a break from, I think, the sort of political consensus we've had. So I think it's fair to say it's the most right-wing government in our lifetimes.
I noticed yesterday the Taxpayers Union actually put out a statement going, no, this budget did not go far enough. It needs to cut more. It needs to. Nicola Willis lied to us. She's being far too left-wing in her budget, which I thought was hilarious. Do pressure groups like that, do you think they have an impact on how a budget is put together or the sort of thought process that goes into how we're going to announce information that comes out?
I don't know if the Taxpayers Union would have had a huge influence in this budget because I think the biggest influence in this budget was Nicola Willis just wanting to deliver on the tax cut she'd promised.
She needs to get that ice cream when she goes to the movies.
But it does. Organisations like the Taxpayers Union do have an influence in our broader political discourse. So they are funded by some large, wealthy interests, opaque interests. We don't know who funds them. Occasionally, it's come out that tobacco's funded them in the past, but they don't publish a list of their donors. So they do have an agenda to basically shrink the size of government and to try and undermine public faith in government. And you see that through, I think, it's quite a smart approach of just doing endless Official Information Act requests, finding every example of government waste they can find and just saying this is emblematic of what a waste government is, we should stop funding government. I think, any organisation will have waste. Every corporation, every business, every family, every government has waste. But they have an agenda of saying, we think government is based and tax is basically a bad thing, and we want to shrink it and drown it. And that, I think, over time has a corrosive impact on our ability to have a democracy where we have a social safety net. We have government investment, the things we need to have. And I don't know what you do about it. It's a free society. Perhaps a bit more transparency would be good. Perhaps other organisations who believe in more of a social safety net, and we believe more in government investment and protecting the vulnerable. I think we need social organisations that push for that. I think certainly, going to the theme of the podcast, I think the disability movement it's been really good to see that pushback on Penny Simmons' moves earlier this year. I think across every different part of society that's impacted, we actually need organisations stepping up and making the argument for investment, for a fair tax system, and for fair treatment of all people. Because if we don't, the ground will be ceded to organisations like the Taxpayers Union that can afford to spend all day putting out press releases and talking to journalists about how terrible government is.
Yeah, Jordan Williams on everything when you wake up in the morning.
Yeah. And look, this is not an organisation that represents anyone. Let's be clear. This is not a grassroots organisation. Yes, people have signed petitions, so they claim they've got thousands of members because people, right-wingers sign petitions and so forth. But I'm on their list somehow. I'm probably considered a member because I get their emails. But they don't actually have a social base. They are an astroturf organisation funded by dark money. And we should remember that as we see them in our political debate, what they are.
When you're working in the office of the Prime Minister and you're dealing with organisations like that, these sort of astroturfing organisations, is that something that you guys are made aware of in advance? It's like, this is so-and-so from Taxpayers Union. We don't know where their money comes from, but we know what their stance is. Like, how does that come into sort of policy and how you deal with them?
Look, I bailed out of Parliament shortly after government was formed, but
Fair enough.
Certainly in my experience, people know what they are. Like no one's in any no one's in any doubt what say the Taxpayers Union is. But I don't think their influence is necessarily directly on government. I don't think ministers are tricked into talking to them and then tricked into doing things. I think it's more that they create a media environment and a political environment that then influences political decisions and political discussion. I often, because a lot of work I do personally is in both public relations and government relations, and I always tell my clients that political opinion sits downstream from public opinion, and public opinion is played out through the media. And so, by the time a politician makes a decision, their options have been narrowed and framed by the public debate, and that's what the Taxpayers Union aims to shift.
The Overton window.
Yeah. Is there anything in this budget that we haven't talked about that you also liked?
Look, there wasn't heaps I liked about the budget, if I'm honest. Like I say, I thought it was politically quite smart, but there was nothing in there where I thought fantastic. This is great. I thought it was pretty dull. It was what they promised, and I think the interesting thing will just be, as I say, whether people whether they get what they hope for, which is people get the tax cuts, are very thankful, the economy improves, and they can ride to 2026 saying we put money in your pocket and got the economy back on track, or whether people bank the tax cuts and say, well, thanks, but what's next? And they continue to struggle with high interest rates and a sluggish economy. So, let's see what happens down the track from here.
Yeah. What in your opinion, apart from what you've already mentioned, be the ideal path back to power for Mr. Hipkins and the Labour Party?
Well, if there was an easy answer,
will it be Mr. Hipkins?
Well, look, I think Chris Hipkins is doing a good job. Whether there is a question here, which is, are New Zealanders ready to say, sorry, Labour, we got it wrong, please come back, within 3 years? I don't know. I think Labor will have to show that it has made some change, that it's going to have to look at some of the areas where it struggled and come up with some new ideas and show that they've learned some lessons. I think that's probably necessary. Whether Chris Hipkins can do that, I don't know. But I don't think Labor has to make the decision yet. Right now, he's polling, he's level pegging and preferred PM with the Prime Minister. Labor's polling is improving, and there is a risk with change that you get someone in who's not experienced and they make a few gaffes and the whole thing starts to unravel. So I think Hipkins deserves a chance for now. And if it doesn't work out close to the election, Labor can make a decision then, or he can make a decision. So leadership is a question, but I think not one for now. In terms of what Labor needs to do, they're going to have to, I think, address concerns around delivery. I think there are some areas where it's unfair, the criticism of them on delivery. There's some cases where I think it's very fair. I cannot understand for the life of me why in 6 years they had not signed a contract for light rail, had not confirmed the route, and had not built an inch of track. That's pretty existential, I think. That if people don't believe you can deliver, that undermines your entire offering to the public. So they have to find a way to demonstrate they've learned their lesson on that. I think a lot of the criticism of their economic management is unfair because they did have a once in 100-year health and economic crisis. But they're going to have to figure out a narrative to rebuild some of that public trust on economic management. And I think, one of the ones that's difficult for people on the left is law and order. I think Labor, they weren't soft on crime, but I think they didn't communicate with the public well enough on that and have a story about crime. And I think they need to be able to give the public confidence around their management of that issue. And I think also they got a bit lost on the treaty, and I think led to some of that backlash we see now. And by lost, I mean Labor seemed to be pushed to and fro by events. They never had a story about what does the treaty relationship look like in 2024? What are we going to do? Why are we doing it? And what are the things we're not going to do? And I think they allowed their opponents to paint them into a corner. And I think they allowed events to sometimes get on top of them. And now we're seeing this backlash. And so I think they need to be a bit clearer about what the treaty relationship looks like. And I think with all those things, you start to see a path then to come back. I think two things have to happen for a Labor government to be elected. The first is they need to convince people they're not going to burn the house down. The second is they need to provide hope. So once they've done all that stuff, they need to find what is the hopeful agenda. And I think that's something Labor needs to think about. What are people missing from this government that they want back? And some of that will be a return to a more open, inclusive society that doesn't target people who are at the margins. But also it's going to have to be an economic story of hope. How are they going to make people's lives better? How are they going to deliver security to families, security to people who are out of work or have fallen on hard times? And so that's a big piece of work. I don't have the answers for it. And it's going to involve discussion around tax, which is notoriously hard. And Labor's having
They're in
that
the
chat
process
right now.
at the moment, aren't they, of organising this sort of tax policy for the next sort of election?
Yeah, and look, it's hard because there's this whole discussion around taxing capital, whether you have a capital gains tax or a wealth tax as proposed by Roxon and Parker before the election, or some other kind of tax. The hard thing with it is, on paper, it looks fantastic. It makes total sense to tax all income the same. It makes no sense why a cleaner pays every dollar of their salary or their wages on tax, but a property investor doesn't. But it's easy to scaremonger, and I've had front row seats where Labor's tried to introduce a capital gains tax, and the scaremongering drives people away. They start, regular, everyday middle New Zealand people who Labor and National fight for to win elections. They worry they're going to get caught up, and you end up with all kinds of scaremongering. And I saw Labor's vote tanked by 5 points in the 2017 campaign when Jacinda announced the CGT. So that's going to be hard. So there's the politics of it. There's also the policy of it. So Labor's working through that at the moment as a party, what that looks like. Hopefully they can come to some kind of agreement and not tear themselves apart, because that's the worst thing that could happen, and finds a way to sell that. And part of that's going to have to be what they do with the money. I think part of the problem the left often has is it talks about great tax schemes, but actually the public, outside of sort of lefty activists, the broader public who are the broader mass of voters, they're not actually excited by a tax on capital. That's not what they're worried about. The trick is to say, here's what we're going to tax, and then here's what we're going to use that money to fund, and then sell the sizzle, not the sausage. So that'll be a big challenge in the next year or so.
Mm. I was talking to Shannon Halbert about a month ago, and we were brought up CGT, and he pointed out, every mention of it just brings out the writers, that the pen and paper comes out, and the amount of complaints from just everybody about the possibility of bringing in a CGT. It's one of those things that it comes with a lot of baggage, which is one of the reasons why the party doesn't want to really deal with it in a way that the more extreme left would like them to. It's quite fascinating that I'm scared of it.
The challenges with a CGT is, even if you exclude the family home, which you probably have to do, it's hard to communicate it to people. People often don't understand that. The other thing is, a lot of people have sort of aspirations of becoming a landlord. That's kind of in New Zealand, since the share market crash particularly, that's how you build wealth in New Zealand, is you buy property. And so there are a lot of people who kind of go, well, my retirement plan is to have a rental property or two. And that those people get scared, and they may never afford it, but they're aspirational. They're kind of temporarily embarrassed millionaires. And so it does become really hard. Then there's other questions about if it's comprehensive capital gains tax. Are we taxing art? Are we taxing small businesses? And it just gets more and more complex. You catch more and more people. There are more and more questions, and each question creates an opportunity to scaremonger. I do think, though, it's possible. I mean, the CGT, the debate has moved on a bit since 2017, 2014, and 2011 when Labour argued for it. I think the OECD has called for it. A lot of business analysts are calling for it. Most people who have looked into it in any depth will say, yeah, it's probably a good idea, it's necessary. So it might be the ground has shifted. I just think it is a really complex debate, and you've got to do it really carefully and strategically, and not blunder into it. And I just think there are some in Labour who are just chomping at the bit to go out there and announce it and campaign on it. And they probably do have to do it, but just be really careful how you do it and be really strategic, because what I would hate would be if there's a chance to knock out this government in one term, and by being foolish and over-enthusiastic on tax, does what Labor's done. And let's be clear, 2011, 2014, 2017, taxes on capital damaged Labor's chances. And in 2020, the abortive wealth tax also damaged Labor's chances, because there was a whole kerfuffle around that and it created political controversy. Just take your time and do it properly is my advice.
I think it's great advice to finish on. Yeah, that's the perfect way to wrap this up. So thank you very much for joining us. It's been very educational. I've learned heaps. Anything you want to finish off there with, Blake?
No. Yeah, that's all good. Thank you, Neale.
Thank you.